Somewhere off the coast of Oman, in the middle of the night, a tanker caught fire in the water, and by the time the sun came up over Washington, American warplanes were already in the air heading toward Iran. That's the sentence that should have led every broadcast this morning. And yet, by the time most people scrolled past it, it had already been buried under a dozen other headlines. So let's slow down, because what happened in the last 24 hours isn't a footnote. It's the reopening of a war that a lot of people were told was already over. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from. Drop it below, because this is one of those stories where it genuinely matters how far it's traveling and who's actually paying attention to it in real time. Here's what we know happened. Late Tuesday, 3 commercial vessels were struck while transiting the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points for global energy on the entire planet. A Qatari-owned liquefied natural gas tanker called the Al Raqayyat was hit and caught fire in its engine room, a fire serious enough that crews feared it could explode. A Saudi-flagged supertanker, the Wedian, was struck as well. Hours later, a third vessel was attacked in the same waters. Qatar publicly pointed the finger at Iran. Iranian state media didn't exactly deny it either, dropping language that read almost like an admission without ever making one official. Within hours, the United States Treasury moved first, revoking a sanctions waiver that had been allowing Iran to sell oil under the terms of a fragile ceasefire agreement. And then, in the early hours of Wednesday morning local time, United States Central Command announced it had launched what it called a series of powerful strikes against Iran, hitting more than 80 targets with precision munitions, air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar installations, anti-ship missile batteries, more than 60 small boats belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the exact force accused of carrying out the tanker attacks in the first place. This wasn't a symbolic pinprick strike. This was a broad, coordinated military operation, and it happened less than an hour's drive from where global oil markets were already holding their breath. Saudi Arabia, whose own supertanker took a direct hit in the attack, didn't stay quiet either, publicly condemning the strike on the Wedian as an assault not just on that single vessel, but on the broader security of international navigation and the stability of global energy supplies. Officials in Washington were equally blunt about the reasoning behind the response, with a senior American official stating plainly that the ceasefire arrangement in place with Iran had always been conditional, that Tehran would only continue reaping its benefits if it demonstrated what was described as good behavior, and that this latest round of attacks in the Strait crossed a line that could not go unanswered. To understand why this moment feels so combustible, you have to understand that this isn't the start of something new. It's the reignition of something that was never actually finished. Back in February of this year, after failed nuclear negotiations collapsed in Geneva, the United States and Israel launched a direct air war against Iran, a brutal 12-day campaign that hit Iranian nuclear infrastructure and military command targets across the country. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in those strikes, an event that fundamentally reshaped the internal balance of power inside Tehran and sent shockwaves through a regime that had built decades of legitimacy around his authority. In retaliation for the war, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz down entirely, laying sea mines, boarding merchant vessels, and issuing blanket warnings that any ship moving in or out of the strait tied to the United States, Israel, or their allies would not be permitted to pass. Understand what that actually meant for the global economy. Before that closure, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas moved through that single waterway. When it shut down, tanker traffic didn't just slow, it collapsed to almost nothing. The International Maritime Organization reported that at the height of the crisis, roughly 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were stranded in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. Ordinary sailors from dozens of nations effectively trapped in a war zone they had no part in starting, some of them describing missiles flying overhead and explosions on nearby vessels while they waited, terrified, for a resolution that took months to arrive. Oil prices spiked. Inflation crept back into economies that had only just started recovering from it. And in a twist that tells you everything about how modern warfare actually redistributes wealth, it was the United States and Russia, the two countries furthest removed from the strait itself, that ended up the biggest financial winners of the entire crisis, together pulling in tens of billions of dollars in additional export revenue while every single Gulf nation that depended on that waterway watched its own revenues shrink, with the sole exception of countries like Saudi Arabia and Oman that had alternative routes bypassing the strait entirely. And even Iran itself, which retained enough control over its own coastline to keep some exports moving, even as it strangled everyone else's. Eventually, after months of standoff, Washington and Tehran reached what was essentially a fragile truce, a memorandum of understanding signed last month that ended the active fighting and reopened the strait to commercial traffic. But if you paid close attention to how that deal was actually structured, you'd have noticed the warning signs baked directly into it. American officials were explicit from the beginning that the agreement was, in their words, entirely performance-based. meaning Iran would only continue receiving the benefits of the deal, including the ability to legally sell its oil again, as long as it kept behaving. That's not the language of a durable peace. That's the language of a ceasefire everyone half expected to break. And it very nearly did break once already, weeks before this latest incident, when a similar pattern of Iranian attacks on shipping triggered a previous round of American retaliation, an exchange that itself drew Iranian strikes against American positions in Bahrain and Kuwait. So what happened this week wasn't a bolt from a clear sky. It was the second time in a matter of weeks that this exact same script has played out. Ships get hit in the Strait, Washington responds with force, and the region holds its breath to see whether the fragile truce survives another round. Now here's where the escalation gets genuinely dangerous, because Iran didn't absorb this latest round of American strikes quietly. Tehran claims it targeted more than 80 American military facilities across Bahrain and Kuwait in direct response, a claim that, if accurate at anywhere close to that scale, represents a level of retaliation far beyond a token gesture, and the timing of all of this couldn't be more combustible on the ground inside Iran itself. This entire exchange is unfolding in the middle of a week-long state funeral procession for Khamenei, the very leader killed in the February war, with mourners across the country openly chanting for vengeance, some of them carrying signs and calling by name for the deaths of both the American president and the Israeli prime minister. That is not the backdrop of a country looking for an off-ramp. That is the backdrop of a population and a leadership structure that feels humiliated, grieving, and under enormous internal pressure to respond with strength rather than restraint. Layer onto that the fact that Iran has spent months insisting that ships can only safely use a specific approved route through the strait, one that requires registering with Tehran directly, essentially asserting a level of control over international waters that no nation is legally entitled to claim. The 3 vessels struck this week were reportedly using a different route near the Omani coastline, the exact route that international maritime authorities had assured shippers was safe and available. Whether that routing dispute was the actual trigger or simply the excuse is something we may never get a completely clean answer to. But it tells you that even the reopened strait was never fully stabilized to begin with. It was more like a pressure valve being held shut by hand. What makes this moment even stranger, and honestly harder to read, is where the President of the United States physically was when all of this happened. Trump wasn't in the Situation Room when the strikes were ordered. He was in Ankara, sitting beside Turkish President Erdogan at a NATO summit, in the middle of announcing an entirely separate and equally consequential shift in policy toward Turkey. 2 enormous stories unfolding in parallel on the exact same day in 2 different corners of the world, both touching the same underlying question of how far Washington is willing to go to reassert its authority in a region that increasingly refuses to stay settled. At that same summit, Trump made a point of praising Turkey specifically for staying out of the Iran conflict, telling reporters that Ankara could have aligned with Tehran to strike at Israel but chose not to, adding somewhat pointedly that maybe they didn't do that because of him personally. Whether or not that's an accurate read of Turkish decision-making, it tells you how Trump himself is narrating this moment as a story about personal leverage and personal relationships, holding a combustible region together, even as American bombers were in the air over Iran at that very same hour. Let's break this apart from a few different angles, because there isn't just one storyline running here, there are several, and they're all colliding at once. The first angle is the economic one, and it's the angle that touches the most people who have never thought about the Strait of Hormuz in their lives. Every time this waterway closes or comes under threat, global oil markets react almost instantly, and this week was no exception, with crude prices jumping on the news before the smoke had even cleared. If the strait becomes unreliable again, even partially, even intermittently, the ripple effects don't stay contained to the Gulf. They show up at gas pumps, and shipping insurance premiums that have already risen sharply in recent weeks, and the cost of goods that depend on energy to move around the planet. The world just spent months clawing its way back from the inflationary shock of the last closure. Nobody wants to relive that, and yet here we are, watching the same pressure points light up again within weeks of the ceasefire being signed. The second angle is the question of Iran's internal politics, because whatever decision-making apparatus authorized these tanker attacks is operating inside a country that just lost its supreme leader to an American and Israeli strike months ago, and is still, quite literally, in the middle of burying him. Regimes under that kind of pressure don't always behave rationally in the way outside observers expect. Sometimes internal weakness produces caution. Sometimes it produces exactly the opposite, a need to project strength outward, specifically because things feel fragile at home. The chants calling for revenge that we're seeing at Khamenei's funeral procession aren't just grief, they're a signal of the political current that any remaining leadership in Tehran has to navigate, and that current is currently pointed directly at further escalation, not away from it. The third angle is the credibility of the ceasefire itself, and this one matters enormously for anyone trying to figure out where this goes next. A deal that gets structured as entirely performance-based, contingent on continuous good behavior, with no real enforcement mechanism beyond the threat of renewed strikes, is inherently unstable by design. It essentially guarantees that any single incident, whether it's a rogue IRGC commander, a genuine command decision out of Tehran, or even an act nobody in the Iranian government explicitly ordered, has the power to blow the entire arrangement apart. We've now watched that exact dynamic play out twice in a matter of weeks. That's not a coincidence, that's a structural flaw in how this truce was built from the very beginning. And the fourth angle is the one that ties everything together. The question of what the United States is actually trying to accomplish here beyond simply responding to provocation. Revoking the oil sanctions waiver wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a direct hit to the one economic lifeline that had been extended to Iran as an incentive to keep behaving. Combine that with a strike package targeting radar sites, anti-ship missiles, and the exact naval forces responsible for the tanker attacks, and what you're looking at isn't just retaliation, it's an attempt to systematically degrade Iran's ability to threaten the Strait again in the near term. Whether that strategy actually works, or whether it simply convinces a wounded and embarrassed government in Tehran that it has nothing left to lose by escalating further, is the single biggest open question hanging over this entire situation right now. There's a version of this where degrading those capabilities actually buys a period of quiet, where a weakened Revolutionary Guard simply lacks the physical means to strike shipping again for weeks or months, giving diplomats room to negotiate something more durable than a performance-based truce. But there's another version, one military planners have to take just as seriously, where a regime already reeling from the loss of its supreme leader interprets renewed American strikes not as a deterrent, but as proof that de-escalation was never actually on the table to begin with, and responds accordingly, not with caution, but with whatever capability it still has left to make the cost of continued conflict as painful as possible for everyone else in the region too. So where does this actually leave the region? And honestly, where does it leave the rest of us watching from thousands of miles away? If you zoom out from the individual strikes and the individual tankers, what you're really looking at is a ceasefire that was always more of a pause than a resolution, now being tested in real time by exactly the kind of incident everyone quietly worried it couldn't survive. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't just carry oil, it carries the confidence of an entire global shipping and insurance industry that depends on predictability to function. And that confidence has now been shaken twice in a matter of weeks. Every additional round of strikes and counterstrikes chips away a little more at the idea that this truce has any real staying power, and every day that passes without a durable resolution increases the odds that some future incident, maybe smaller than this one, maybe bigger, ends up being the one that finally collapses the whole arrangement for good. Insurers had already been quietly raising the cost of covering vessels moving through the strait in the days before this latest attack, war risk premiums climbing sharply enough that, for the largest crude carriers, a single transit could now cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, more than it did before tensions began building again. That's not an abstract financial detail, that's the market itself. Pricing in the expectation that something like this week's attack was coming, long before it actually happened, which tells you the people whose job it is to quantify risk in this region had already concluded the ceasefire was far more fragile than the diplomatic language surrounding it suggested. There's also a deeper, more uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, which is what an American administration is willing to accept as the new normal in the Gulf. Are these periodic flare-ups, tanker attacks followed by retaliatory strikes followed by an uneasy quiet, something Washington is prepared to simply manage indefinitely, treating them as the price of keeping the strait nominally open? Or is there a point at which this pattern tips over into something closer to a full resumption of the war that supposedly ended in June? Nobody watching the strikes unfold this week can answer that with any real confidence, including, I suspect, the people inside the Pentagon and the White House currently deciding what comes next. And that's really where this leaves us, with more questions than answers, and with a timeline that keeps refusing to settle into anything resembling stability. Does Iran, still bearing its supreme leader and absorbing another round of American strikes, choose further escalation to satisfy the anger visible in its own streets? Or does internal exhaustion, after everything this country has already endured this year, finally win out over the appetite for revenge? Does the ceasefire framework survive a second major breach in a matter of weeks? Or has it already quietly failed in every way that matters, with both sides simply too invested in the fiction of a truce to admit it out loud? What happens to global oil markets if a third round of tanker attacks hits the strait before the month is even out? And what does it say about the current state of American foreign policy that the president could be simultaneously reshaping a NATO alliance in Ankara and authorizing a wave of strikes against Iran on the very same day, treating both as separate news items in the same news cycle rather than two pieces of one much larger, much more volatile picture? Nobody has clean answers to any of that tonight. What we have is smoke over the Strait of Hormuz, a funeral procession still working its way through the streets of Tehran, oil markets bracing for whatever comes next, and a ceasefire that increasingly looks like it was only ever one bad night away from falling apart. Where this actually goes from here, genuinely, I don't think anyone fully knows yet.